50%. Half of every single dollar the WNBA generates. That's what the Players Association walked into negotiations demanding, and they backed it up with the most nuclear threat in professional sports: blow up the entire 2026 season if they don't get it. On paper, it sounds like a powerful move, a united front. Athletes standing their ground against billionaire owners in a league that's kept them underpaid for decades. The kind of story that writes itself into a cultural moment. The kind of story that generates op-eds and Twitter threads and celebrity endorsements and all the other machinery of modern public sympathy. But here's what the headlines didn't tell you. The moment Caitlin Clark laced up her sneakers and stepped onto the Team USA practice floor, that entire strategy started crumbling from the inside. Not because of anything she said, not because of any interview, any subtweet, any public shot fired at the union or its leadership. She just played basketball. And in doing so, she quietly dismantled the most important negotiating weapon the veterans thought they had: leverage. Real, measurable, market-tested leverage. The kind that doesn't come from press releases or carefully worded statements to sympathetic journalists. The kind that comes from ratings documents and sponsor contracts and the cold, unfeeling arithmetic of who shows up to watch and who stays home. What we're about to get into isn't the version of this story that ESPN is running. This is the part they keep glossing over, the part buried under the surface of the labor dispute coverage, the part that actually explains what's happening to this league at its foundation, and why the 2026 season might be decided not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, but by everything that already happened on that Team USA practice court and in those unrivaled arena seats that never quite filled up the way the organizers promised they would. This is a story about leverage, about what it actually means to have it, what it means to lose it, and what happens when a sports league discovers in real time that the gap between what it thought it was worth and what the market says it's worth is wider than anyone was willing to admit. Buckle in, because this one goes deep. To understand how we got here, you have to go back. Not 5 years, not 10, almost 30. For the better part of 3 decades, the WNBA existed the way a lot of things exist when someone else is footing the bill. It survived, it persisted, but it never truly independently thrived in the way that a financially self-sustaining sports enterprise needs to thrive in order to have real negotiating power at a collective bargaining table. The NBA was essentially running a financial life support operation, subsidizing teams that were bleeding cash at a rate that would have destroyed any standalone business operating in the real market. And when we say subsidizing, we don't mean a modest backstop or a short-term bridge loan while the league found its footing. We mean structural, ongoing year-over-year financial dependency that lasted for decades and shaped every aspect of how the WNBA operated. The arenas were borrowed from NBA franchises. The administrative infrastructure was borrowed. The operational credibility that kept sponsors at the table came attached to the NBA's name and the NBA's relationships, not the WNBA's own independently built brand equity. Think about what that actually means for a league's identity and its negotiating position. When you are financially dependent on another organization, when your survival is contingent on the goodwill and continued investment of a parent entity that didn't create you primarily for profit reasons, but for a combination of marketing, optics, and genuine mission-driven interest in growing women's sports, you are not operating from strength. You are operating from gratitude. And gratitude is a terrible foundation for a collective bargaining strategy built around aggressive revenue demands. The product on the floor during those years was genuinely good basketball, real athletes, real talent, real moments of brilliance that deserved larger audiences than they received. Sue Bird, Diana Taurasi, Tamika Catchings, generational players who built careers in a league that couldn't properly compensate them, who spent off seasons playing overseas in Turkey and Russia just to make ends meet, who carried the weight of a sport that the broader American sports market had quietly decided wasn't worth their sustained attention. Those players deserve enormous respect for what they built during years when building it was genuinely hard. But those years also created something dangerous inside the culture of the league, a shared belief that survival itself was the achievement, that simply existing, continuing to put a product on the floor every season, despite the financial headwinds and the limited audiences and the borrowed infrastructure, was proof of value, that the struggle itself constituted a kind of equity. That belief was understandable given the circumstances, and it was about to get tested by market forces that don't grade on a curve and don't award points for effort or history or how difficult the journey was to get here. The test came in the form of a draft pick, and nothing about the WNBA would ever look quite the same again. Nobody in the WNBA front office, no network executive, no sports economist with a spreadsheet of women's basketball projections had a model that predicted what happened when Caitlin Clark made the transition from college basketball to the professional game. The scale of what she had done at Iowa was visible. The attendance records, the television ratings that routinely competed and sometimes exceeded men's college basketball, the social media engagement numbers that made marketing executives do double takes. All of that was documented and real.
But the conventional wisdom inside sports business circles held that college stars don't always translate their audience to the professional game. The casual fans who showed up for the college version of a story might not follow it into the WNBA. The conditions were different. The stakes felt different. The marketing infrastructure was different. There were real reasons to be cautious about assuming Clark's college impact would simply transplant itself into Indiana Fever box office numbers and national television ratings. Those reasons evaporated within weeks of her professional debut. The audience didn't just follow Clark to the WNBA. It arrived in numbers and with an intensity that the league had never previously encountered. Television ratings didn't tick upward modestly in markets where she was playing. They exploded. Networks that had treated WNBA broadcast rights as a budget line item, valuable primarily for filling programming hours during a slow sports calendar period, suddenly found themselves in a completely different conversation about what those rights were worth and what audiences they could reliably deliver. Sponsors who had passed on women's basketball investment for years came back to the table, not with exploratory interest, not with pilot programs to test the waters, with real money and real multi-year commitments. And the casual sports fan, the demographic that had largely ignored the WNBA for 30 years, the person who watches the Super Bowl and March Madness and maybe follows their local NFL team, but had never previously had a reason to engage with women's professional basketball, that fan showed up. They bought Indiana Fever tickets in numbers that overwhelmed the team's ticket infrastructure. They watched games in cities where Clark wasn't even playing because the broader narrative she was generating had become compelling enough to hold national attention. They followed storylines. They engaged in debates. They participated in the kind of organic, unprompted cultural conversation that no sports marketing budget can manufacture. The viewership numbers from Clark's rookie season weren't just records. They were a different category of record entirely. Franchise records, league records, records for women's professional sports broadly, and in some cases, records that competed seriously with viewership benchmarks for men's professional sports leagues that had decades of established audience relationships behind them. Revenue projections that had been conservative for years were rewritten. The WNBA's negotiation position with broadcast partners transformed because of one player's presence on one team's roster. The league had its first genuine, sustained, mainstream cultural moment since its founding. And the veterans watched all of this happen and reached a conclusion that felt completely logical from inside their perspective, but would prove to be one of the most expensive strategic miscalculations in the history of professional sports labor negotiations. They looked at everything Clark had generated, the fans, the ratings, the sponsor interest, the cultural attention, and they told themselves it belonged to the collective.
that the audience had come for women's basketball and would stay for women's basketball, regardless of any individual player's presence or absence. That the tide had risen, and rising tides lift all boats. That assumption had exactly one logical test, and nobody at the union table seemed particularly interested in running it before they built their entire CBA strategy on top of it. Walking into the collective bargaining fight, the Players Association had constructed a strategy that looked powerful on paper and felt powerful in rooms full of people who shared the same fundamental assumptions about where the value in their sport actually lived. The league was generating more money than ever. The product had never been more culturally visible. The moment felt like it had arrived after decades of waiting, and the demands reflected that belief in full. 50% of league revenue, guaranteed maximum contracts with numbers that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier, guaranteed housing provisions, significantly improved travel conditions that addressed the legitimate and long-standing grievances of players who had spent careers in conditions that no other major professional sports league would have tolerated. Charter flights instead of commercial travel, real financial security for players who had historically spent their careers one injury away from financial hardship. The framing around these demands was built around a narrative that had genuine emotional and historical weight behind it. Players had been exploited for decades in a league that survived primarily because they showed up and competed at an elite level for compensation that bore no reasonable relationship to the value they were creating for the enterprise. The new revenue surge was proof not that the product had suddenly become valuable, but that it had always been valuable and had simply never been properly compensated. The billionaire owners were finally being asked to share equitably in a prosperity that the players themselves had built.
It's a compelling argument. It generates the kind of public sympathy that makes for powerful op-eds and union communications. It has political resonance and media traction and the kind of cultural momentum that a labor movement needs to sustain itself through a long negotiation. And it rested entirely and without exception on one central assumption, that nobody inside the union's strategic inner circle seems to have seriously stress-tested before committing to it. The assumption, this audience is here for the sport, not the star. If that assumption holds, everything else follows logically. You can make aggressive demands because the product has independent value, because the fans will be there when the season returns from a work stoppage, because owners face real financial consequences from losing games and losing momentum. The leverage is genuine because the thing the owners need, a functioning league with an engaged audience, can only exist if the players are on the floor. But if that assumption is false, everything inverts. If the audience is specifically and almost exclusively there for one player, then the leverage calculation changes completely. You can't credibly threaten to take away something the other side knows it can survive without. And the other side is looking at the same ratings documents you are. They know exactly what the numbers look like with Clark on the floor and what they look like without her. They were going to figure out whether the union's central assumption was accurate sooner or later. What nobody anticipated was that the veterans would run the experiment themselves, publicly, on national television, before the CBA fight had even reached its most critical stage. The idea behind Unrivaled was straightforward and, from the union's perspective, strategically elegant. Build a premium 3-on-3 off-season league featuring the WNBA's biggest veteran stars. Put it on national television with real production values and real network backing. Market it aggressively. Give it time to breathe and build an audience. And in doing so, demonstrate to every sponsor, every broadcast partner, every ownership group, and every casual sports fan paying attention to the WNBA labor fight that this collection of veteran talent could generate ratings and cultural relevance completely independent of Caitlin Clark's involvement. The infrastructure behind Unrivaled was not a shoestring operation. TNT committed broadcast resources and airtime. The marketing investment was real. Rosters featured players who had spent years building names as the faces of women's basketball: Breanna Stewart, Aaliyah Boston, and other veterans whose credentials were legitimate and whose star power within women's basketball circles was genuine. The production values were professional. The intent was clear, and it was clearly understood by everyone in the sports business world who was paying attention. This was a proof of concept, a live demonstration, an argument made in ratings and viewership and sponsor engagement rather than in press releases and negotiating position papers. It was supposed to be the moment the veterans showed the market that Clark wasn't the story, that women's basketball was the story, and they were women's basketball. The games tipped off, and within days, the market delivered a verdict that was so swift and so complete that it functionally restructured the entire negotiating landscape before anyone at the union table had a chance to spin it, or contextualize it, or attribute it to external factors. Viewership collapsed. Not in the gradual, ambiguous way that gives a struggling product room to adjust and reposition and find its audience. Immediately, decisively. Fans who had spent the previous WNBA season engaged with women's basketball in ways they had never previously been engaged made their choices in real time, and those choices showed up in Nielsen data within the first week of games. The ratings weren't disappointing relative to modest expectations. They were a verdict. The kind of numbers that travel from measurement reports to the desks of broadcast executives and sponsor representatives and paint a picture that nobody in the room wants to talk about out loud, but everyone can clearly see. The show had star power. It had production quality. It had network backing. It had aggressive marketing. It had everything the conventional wisdom says a new sports property needs to build an audience. What it didn't have was Caitlin Clark. And the audience, it turned out, had noticed. They had noticed in the most direct, most measurable, most commercially significant way possible. They watched something else. Then came the injury. Aaliyah Boston, one of the cornerstones of what Unrivaled was supposed to represent, and one of the players who had done everything right in terms of building her profile and her game in the WNBA system, suffered a significant injury during what were supposed to be low-stakes exhibition games. Physical liability layered on top of commercial catastrophe. Players who needed to be healthy for the WNBA season were getting hurt in an off-season venture that had just demonstrated it couldn't generate the audience it promised it could. The losses were compounding in multiple directions simultaneously.
The veterans had assembled their most powerful argument, packaged it professionally, put it on national television, and watched the market evaluate it and return it with a response that no amount of strategic reframing could disguise. When you are demanding half of a league's revenue, you need to be able to demonstrate that you generate that revenue. Unrivaled was built specifically to make that demonstration. It made a different one instead. And everyone at the collective bargaining table, regardless of which side they were sitting on, had access to the same ratings documents. Here is the thing about Caitlin Clark's response to all of this that separates her from virtually every other athlete who has ever found themselves positioned at the center of a labor dispute they didn't create, didn't ask to be part of, and had complicated personal incentives around how to handle publicly. The response was nothing. Silence. Complete, deliberate, strategically devastating silence. Not a carefully worded statement acknowledging the union's concerns while gently distancing herself from the tactics. Not a leak to a friendly reporter who could be trusted to frame things favorably. Not a subtweet that could be screenshotted and circulated as evidence of either solidarity or betrayal, depending on the reader's priors. Not a single public word that could be clipped, edited, played on a loop, and used to either support or undermine any narrative that anyone at the negotiating table was trying to construct. She showed up to Team USA camp and played basketball. That choice, and it was absolutely a choice, made by someone with advisors and agents and a very clear understanding of the media environment she was operating in, communicated more than any press conference could have managed. The optics of her presence on that Team USA floor, juxtaposed against the ongoing chaos of the WNBA labor fight, produced a contrast that no PR firm could have engineered and no crisis communication strategy could have neutralized. Consider what was happening simultaneously. Union vice presidents were leaking internal letters to ESPN, the content of those letters revealing that even within the union's own leadership structure, there were members begging for basic transparency about where the negotiations stood and what the strategy actually was. The communication apparatus around the strike threat was fraying at multiple points, with public signals suggesting that the united front was neither as united nor as strategically coherent as the initial positioning had implied. The narrative of collective strength was showing visible cracks in the most public possible venue. And Clark was running drills with Breanna Stewart on the Team USA practice court, visible competitive joy radiating off both of them in footage that circulated without any promotional push behind it because it didn't need one. The joy was real, the chemistry was real, the competitive intensity was real. You can't manufacture that kind of footage in a controlled media environment, and you can't suppress it once it exists because the market for authentic athlete content is enormous and immediate. The psychological contrast between the two environments, the fractured, leaking, internally divided WNBA union communication structure versus the accountable, purposeful, visibly joyful Team USA training environment, was the most honest broadcast the WNBA could have possibly aired during that period. Not because anyone engineered it that way, because the gap between the two realities was simply too wide to hide when both were happening simultaneously and both were generating footage that traveled across the same sports media ecosystem. The union strike narrative required a specific visual to sustain itself. It needed the players to look like what the narrative said they were: underpaid, undervalued, ground down by a system that prioritized billionaire owner profits over the athletes who actually made the product work. That's a legitimate argument with real historical backing, but it requires the players to project a certain kind of struggle, a certain kind of weight, a certain kind of visible grievance. And every second of Team USA footage showing Clark competing with unforced enthusiasm and genuine delight was actively working against that requirement. Sponsors watching that Team USA footage were not seeing a league in crisis. They were seeing one investment that was safe, premium, globally scalable, and capable of generating the kind of authentic athletic content that audiences engage with across every platform and every market. They were seeing Clark, and the ledger in their heads was calculating the return on that specific investment in real time. The union's narrative had no mechanism to interrupt that calculation. The market was running it with or without anyone's permission. Then came the moment that functioned as a punctuation mark on everything that had been building. Not a manufactured punctuation mark, not a carefully staged media event designed to generate maximum impact at maximum strategic timing, a real basketball moment. The kind that the sport has always been capable of producing, and that no labor dispute and no CBA negotiation and no collective bargaining strategy can create on command or suppress when it happens organically.
Late in a competitive Team USA camp session, in a real pressure situation with the stakes elevated and teammates watching with the kind of attention that only exists when athletes are genuinely competing rather than going through promotional motions, Clark hit the game winner. A pressure-tested, contested, competitive shot in a setting that was asking real athletic questions and getting real athletic answers. Not a layup in a garbage-time situation that the marketing team could frame as a highlight, an actual game-winning shot in an actual pressure moment. The teammate reaction was immediate and completely unscripted, the kind of reaction you only get when something real just happened in front of people who know how rare real is, who have spent their careers competing at elite levels and can therefore measure instantly and accurately the quality of what they just witnessed. That reaction, authentic, spontaneous, captured on cameras that happened to be present, not because anyone planned for this specific moment, but because cameras are always present in Team USA environments, was the thing that made the clip travel. It moved without any promotional infrastructure behind it. No coordinated release strategy, no timing calculation designed to maximize platform reach, no social media team pushing it across accounts with optimized captions and algorithmic timing. It just traveled, the way things travel in the current media environment when they capture something that feels undeniably, recognizably real. Sports fans have extraordinarily well-calibrated detectors for authenticity, developed across years of consuming content that ranges from the genuinely compelling to the transparently manufactured. They know the difference immediately, and they responded to that clip immediately, in the volumes and with the enthusiasm that only real athletic moments generate. Every sponsor who saw that footage understood something about their investment calculation that no revenue projection document could have communicated with equivalent efficiency. Every broadcast executive who saw it understood something about future rights negotiations that no union demands or ownership counteroffers had managed to clarify. Every casual fan who encountered it on their timeline understood, perhaps without being able to articulate exactly why, that what they were watching was the reason people watch sports in the first place. The moment, the shot, the reaction, the specific electricity that moves through a group of elite athletes when something remarkable has just happened. The clip had a face, the moment had an architect, and by the time it had completed its circulation across every major sports platform, the negotiating table had shifted in ways that no subsequent press release, no matter how carefully worded, was going to shift back. The market had made its statement, clearly and publicly, in the language it speaks most fluently. Authentic, athletic moments that generate organic audience engagement without requiring anyone to be told to care. Let's be precise about what all of this means for the CBA fight heading into what is genuinely the most consequential off-season in the WNBA's history. Precision matters here because the surface-level narrative, union demands, ownership resistance, possible work stoppage, obscures the actual power dynamics that will determine how this gets resolved and on whose terms. The union can still threaten a work stoppage. That option hasn't been legally or logistically removed from the table. The mechanisms exist, the rhetoric is in place. The public framing around player rights and fair compensation has real resonance with audiences who care about labor issues broadly, and there is genuine media appetite for a narrative that positions athletes against owners in a fight for economic justice. None of that infrastructure has disappeared, but the leverage behind the threat, the actual market power that gives a strike threat its credibility with the people sitting on the other side of the table, has been hollowed out by 2 consecutive data points that arrived in public view before the most critical stage of negotiations. And hollowed out isn't a rhetorical flourish, it's a specific, measurable description of what happened when the market evaluated the union's central claim and returned a result that contradicted it. Unrivaled's ratings collapse removed the foundation of the 50% revenue demand. When you claim half of league revenue, you need to be able to demonstrate that you generate league revenue independently of any individual player's presence. The Unrivaled 3-on-3 league was built specifically to make that demonstration. It generated evidence for the opposite conclusion. The veteran talent base, assembled professionally and marketed aggressively and broadcast on a legitimate national network, produced viewership numbers that confirmed what ownership groups had quietly suspected but couldn't prove before Unrivaled gave them the proof. The commercial engine of this sport is not the collective talent pool, it is one specific player.
Clark's Team USA performance removed the second pillar. If the first pillar was "we generate the revenue," the second pillar was "we are the only place where this revenue can be generated." The WNBA is the platform, and without it, the commercial value disappears. The Team USA footage, particularly the game winner clip and the broader narrative of Clark competing joyfully and brilliantly on an international stage, demonstrated that the commercial value travels with the player, not with the platform. The engine can generate an audience anywhere it operates. It does not need the WNBA specifically. The WNBA needs it.
Billionaire owners negotiating a collective bargaining agreement are not sentimental actors. They are financial actors responding to incentives and data points. The data points they now possess tell them something very specific about the strike threat they're facing. A work stoppage hurts them, but it hurts the veteran players far more severely, and it does not hurt the one player whose commercial value drives the negotiation's entire context. That asymmetry fundamentally changes how seriously ownership needs to treat the threat of a 2026 season disappearing. The passengers need the engine. The engine has demonstrated it does not need the passengers, or at least does not need this specific vehicle to reach its destination. That's not a comfortable framing for anyone who has invested their career in the WNBA system and genuinely deserves better compensation than they've historically received. But comfort is not the market's primary concern. The market is working with the data it has, and the data it has was generated by choices the veteran players and union leadership made themselves. Here is the question that sits at the center of everything now, uncomfortable and unavoidable in equal measure. Does the union's leadership have the capacity to look at what just happened, not the version of events they'd prefer to be true, but the version the market actually produced, and recalibrate accordingly? It's not a small ask. Recalibration means acknowledging that the 50% demand was built on an assumption that didn't survive contact with reality. It means coming back to the table with numbers that reflect actual market dynamics, rather than aspirational projections about collective leverage that the data has since refuted. It means negotiating a deal that improves conditions for players, better travel, improved minimums, real financial security, genuine quality of life upgrades that address the legitimate grievances that have existed in this league for decades, without anchoring those improvements to a revenue percentage that the market has just demonstrated isn't justified by the collective's independent commercial value. That's a politically difficult thing to do inside a union structure. The members who voted for aggressive demands based on the belief that their collective leverage was strong are not going to celebrate a leadership team that comes back from the table with a substantially scaled-down deal. The internal politics of union negotiations are complex in ways that external observers often underestimate. Leaders who publicly committed to specific demands face real consequences when those demands don't materialize, regardless of whether the market reality ever justified them. But the alternative is worse. Pressing forward with a strike threat that ownership now understands is structurally compromised means risking a work stoppage that delivers maximum pain to the people with the least financial cushion to absorb it. WNBA veterans, despite having leveraged their off-season options better than their predecessors, are not operating from positions of personal financial security that allow them to absorb an extended period without league income. The billionaire owners can wait. The players, for the most part, cannot. And the one player whose commercial presence makes the entire conversation relevant has already demonstrated she has professional options that exist completely outside the WNBA's CBA framework. There is a deal available here that improves conditions meaningfully without requiring anyone to misread the leverage map. Significantly improved travel conditions, real minimum salary increases, better housing support, health and wellness provisions that reflect the physical demands the game places on athletes' bodies, a revenue-sharing structure tied to actual demonstrated market growth rather than a fixed percentage built on leverage that wasn't there, a framework that rewards the growth that Clark's presence is generating without pretending the collective had equally generated it independently. That deal is possible. Whether the people in the room can get past the gap between what they wanted and what the market says is available, that's the question that 2026 season is waiting on. Step back from the CBA details for a moment, because what is unfolding in this WNBA labor fight is bigger than one collective bargaining negotiation. What is happening in public with every data point and every piece of Team USA footage and every Unrivaled ratings document is a live demonstration of a tension that women's sports has been navigating quietly and uncomfortably for years.
The tension is between collective progress and individual star power. between the genuine moral and strategic value of solidarity as an organizing principle and the cold market reality that commercial growth in professional sports is almost never driven by collective talent, it's driven by individual stars who generate the kind of cultural electricity that turns casual observers into engaged fans. Every major sports league in the world understands this tension. The NBA has it between LeBron James and the broader player population. The NFL has it between its star quarterbacks and the offensive linemen who play anonymously in front of them. The difference in the WNBA's case is that the concentration is more extreme, the timeline is more compressed, and the negotiation is happening in a period when the gap between the star's market value and the collective's market value has been measured in real time, publicly, with data that everyone can access. The traditional union argument rests on solidarity. Everyone rises together. The product belongs to everyone who contributes to it, and the commercial value generated by the product belongs equitably to those contributors. That argument has driven meaningful progress in professional sports labor relations for decades, and it is not wrong as a principle. Players who operate in supporting roles contribute real value to a product that would be diminished without them. The argument for collective compensation is real, but it runs into a specific structural problem when the commercial value of a product is so heavily concentrated in a single individual that the market produces measurably different outcomes depending on that individual's presence or absence. At that point, the solidarity argument and the market data are pulling in opposite directions, and the negotiating table becomes a place where one side is arguing from principle while the other side is reading Nielsen reports and drawing different conclusions. Clark didn't create this problem. She didn't ask to be the singular commercial engine of a sport that needed one. She didn't engineer the unrivaled failure, or the Team USA moment, or the game winner clip. She played basketball. The market responded to how she plays basketball in a specific way, and the WNBA's labor negotiation is now happening in the context of what that market response has revealed about where the actual value in the sport currently lives. The veterans who built careers in a harder era of this league aren't villains in this story. They played through genuinely difficult conditions and advocated for improvements that were legitimate and necessary. The union's core mission, improving the lives of professional athletes who have historically been underpaid, is correct and important. But advocacy built on a misreading of the leverage map isn't just ineffective, it's counterproductive to the actual goal because it hardens positions, burns negotiating goodwill, and risks the kind of season-canceling work stoppage that could undo years of hard-built growth that nobody, not the players, not the owners, not the fans, not the sponsors, can afford to walk back from. The shot drops, the clip travels, the ratings document sits on the desk, and somewhere in a room full of lawyers and agents and union representatives and ownership executives, someone is doing the math on what it costs to misread this specific moment in this specific sport, in this specific inflection point in its history. The 2026 season is approaching. The answer to whether it actually happens, whether the league that finally found its commercial footing is going to protect that footing or gamble it away, is going to tell us everything about whether the people running this sport understand what just shifted. Because the market already wrote the script, the only question left is whether anyone at the table has read it. Here's where all of this leaves us, and it's worth being honest about the complexity of where that actually is. The WNBA is at an inflection point that it may not revisit for another generation. The commercial growth that Clark's arrival generated created a window, real, valuable, time-sensitive, for the league to build something durable. Better broadcast deals, stronger sponsor relationships, a casual fan base that has now experienced women's basketball as a compelling product and could be retained with the right conditions. That window doesn't stay open indefinitely. Windows like this close when the moment that opened them passes, or when the decisions made inside the window are bad enough to close it prematurely. The union's leadership made a bet.
They bet that the leverage was real, that the collective market value was genuine, and that the aggressive demands were the right opening position for a negotiation with owners who had benefited for decades from underpaying the people who made their product work. Some of that bet was grounded in history and principle. Some of it was grounded in an assumption about the source of the recent commercial growth that the market has since evaluated and found wanting. The owners made a counter-calculation. They watched Unrivaled's numbers come in. They watched the Team USA footage circulate. They assessed the gap between the union's leverage claim and the leverage reality and reached conclusions that are going to shape how seriously they treat the work stoppage threat in the months ahead. None of this means the players should walk away with nothing. It means they're going to walk away with something different from what they asked for. And the distance between the ask and the result is a direct function of the data points that accumulated between the initial demand and the negotiating deadline.
Clark plays on. That's probably the most important sentence in this entire story. Whatever happens at the bargaining table, whatever the 2026 season looks like or doesn't look like, the player who has reset the commercial parameters of this sport continues to demonstrate in every public appearance exactly why the reset happened and exactly what the market is paying for when it pays attention to women's basketball right now. She is not waiting for the labor dispute to resolve itself. She is not holding her commercial presence hostage to the outcome of a negotiation she has no direct stake in. She is playing basketball at the highest level she can find in the most visible environments available, and the market is responding to that basketball the same way it has responded to it since she walked onto an Indiana Fever court for the first time. The leverage map has been drawn. The data is public. The question now is whether the people in the room are going to negotiate with the map as it actually exists or with the map they wished had been produced. That answer is coming. The 2026 season is the deadline, and when the verdict arrives, it will tell us more about this league, its culture, its leadership, and its actual relationship with the market forces that determine its financial future than any press release or negotiating position paper ever could. The market wrote the script. Now we wait to see who's been reading it.